How do attackers find our networks and our systems, especially those that are exposed directly to the internet? That's what we're actually going to cover in this video when we're actually talking about looking for domain names. And that also includes subdomain domains and system names that we're going to get into, or fully qualified domain names, looking for IP addresses, and we're even going to talk about autonomous system numbers that become important when tracking, especially medium or large-sized environments. So we're going to just jump right in. And when we look at from an OSINT perspective, right? From an OSINT perspective, we want to be able to find as many, talk about vulnerabilities or exposures for our target environment, whether it's our own company, whether it's for a client. But the idea is we want to find as many exposures. To find as many exposures, we have to find as many systems as possible. Well, to do that, we have to find where those systems reside in the world of this target environment. And we can do that by looking for domain names associated with the company, and that includes subdomains for all those domains. So if I have a domain like netflix.com, what are the subdomains potentially under there? And as we find and we look for subdomains, we also find fully qualified domain names or system names. And a lot of those that we find typically are going to be web pages that are exposed to the internet. Not always, but that's a lot of what we'll find, especially when using a search engine like Google, because all it does is index web pages. So we'll look at how we find those domains, those sites. We'll look at the idea of the fully qualified domain name. Again, we want to find as many systems as possible. More systems, more exposures. Of course, those systems reside in IP ranges. So we're going to look at how do we find the IP addresses associated with these particular systems. And then if I have a single IP address, well, how do I map it to the overall subnet that it resides in? Because it's not always as cut and dry as we see on internal networks where you're used to seeing a kind of /24 standard class C subnet perhaps, or class A /8 subnet. Out on the internet, you can see all these funky or strange different subnet masks that can throw you off. And especially if you get into active testing or doing penetration testing, you might potentially make an accident or a slip and start testing against an organization that you don't have permission to. So we'll look at that. And then we'll look at autonomous system numbers, or ASNs, which allow you to group multiple subnet ranges together and associate them with a single company. So it's not as maybe crazy as it sounds. And if you're not familiar with them, hopefully it'll make sense once we take a peek. Now, one easy way to get started, if you're looking for either subdomains or systems associated with a domain, especially web pages, then we can start with Google. And here's a great example. And we're going to go ahead and just jump over to the browser and run this real quick. So we have Google, and the idea is I can specify a site. And we talked about this a little bit earlier with the different Google search operators, but I'm going to type in site : and then we're going to focus on netflix.com. Right? And if I just run a search for site : netflix.com, which tells Google, just show me everything Google has related to the site netflix.com. And you can see, boom, here's everything we have that's coming from netflix.com that Google knows about. Now, as we start going through the list and we want to find either subdomains or systems or sites that are associated with it, what we can do is we can tell Google to take out certain things. Like the first result should have been a little obvious, right? We should have known, oh yeah, www.netflix.com is going to show up. But remember, that's a system and an application within the netflix.com domain named www. So, okay, we'll definitely put that on our list for testing. But as far as finding different subdomains and other systems, let's go ahead and take it out. So we can do the minus sign and then just type in www.netflix.com, hit enter, and now you can see, oh, it's off the list. And now we have another one for help.netflix.com. Sorry, I scrolled. So now we know, okay, we have netflix.com, we have www.netflix.com. Oh, now we have help.netflix.com, and you can go through the process, continually loop through it. So, okay, well, now I know help.netflix.com is a potential target with vulnerabilities. Okay, well, what else is there? Right. So we take out help, and now we see about. And then we can take out about, and then we can find there's research.netflix.com. And again, you can just keep going and going and going until you run out of options. That's a quick way to get started. And I find it interesting, as this way, again, really not only to find really these kind of subdomains or really system names, but they're really different web pages within that domain, since again we're using Google and Google indexes web pages. So I think when we talk about OSINT overall, though, we don't want to limit ourselves just to individual web pages. So typically, while this is a great exercise to start with, it's not just what we're going to focus on. In fact, let's flip back to the slides real quick. There's a whole world of different tools out there. I'm a really big fan of the first two, and that's because you can use these in a browser. Now, the other tools are great as well. Most of these you're going to be running on something like Kali Linux, though. So it's not as quick and easy or painless as going to a browser and running a search. And that's okay. Right? And we'll go back and we'll look at those other tools as well. And that's really the rest of this section, is looking at these different types of tools and how we find information about domain names and IP addresses and the subnets and the IP addresses that are associated with our target environments. Now, I really like DNSlytics, and I've used this for years. And everybody has their different site that they like to go to or they prefer to do research on an IP address, especially when not only doing OSINT, but if you do a lot of maybe incident detection or incident response work, or just OSINT in general, right? You need to find out information about a particular IP address or a domain name. For me, DNSlytics is great, and you get a lot of searches for free. There's also a low-cost option that you can use if you run a ton of searches in a single day. So there's that option. But let's go back to the browser, and we can go ahead and flip over to DNSlytics. And this is the main page, right? And in this case, and it might look a little funky, because if we're looking for something like netflix.com, right? Or even we'll make it a little bit more specific. I'm going to say www.netflix.com. Right? So the main web page associated with, in this case, the target environment. Now, DNSlytics gives you a lot of options now. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of this page, but what we're going to do, we're just going to take the first one, and I'm going to go to the IP report for www.netflix.com. Again, this is kind of our starting point. It gives us a general idea of, okay, when I go to www.netflix.com, where am I really going, right? I am going to a web page, but in this case, you can see not only, it's in Ireland, right? It's hosted in Dublin, but that it's hosted in the Amazon cloud. So that's a good piece of information to know, right? In this case, Netflix.com is hosted in the cloud and not on premise in a data center that they manage themselves. That probably assume that, but it's good to know, because some organizations actually prefer to host their own systems versus hosting them in the cloud, even though that's becoming less popular these days. You can see, yes, that's Amazon under the provider name. We can also see, there's our ASN, or Autonomous System Number. And you can see the ASN is 16509, which means Amazon has Amazon the company, right? Amazon.com Inc. has one and only one ASN number associated with it, 16509. And all of the IP ranges, if they're assigned to Amazon appropriately, they should be assigned to this ASN. So there we can see the ASN, and we're going to come back and talk about that later. We're going to see it in a couple other places. What I was mentioning earlier is not only do we have the IP address associated with www.netflix.com, right, at 54.246.79.9, which we can see at the top of the page, but we can also see the subnet mask and the subnet range, right, under IP range. So we can see, oh, it has this /17 subnet mask, which is really ugly, right? If you're trying to calculate subnets in your head and like, what range is this? Oh, they give it to us, thankfully, because it's 54.246.0.0 through 54.246.127.255. That's a fairly strange subnet mask for a lot of people to work with. So it's nice that we have this, and we're not assuming something like /24, because then again, we could go into higher IP addresses and start attacking those and not have authorization, and then technically we're breaking the law at that point. And there's some other information. You can see that that IP address isn't associated with any known malicious activity, which is great, as we would expect. There's only one domain hosted on the IP address, as we expect. And it's not being used for mail servers or DNS servers. And again, it's in Dublin. So there's a lot of great high-level information that they provide. And then we can scroll real quickly. And we saw some of this early in the course when we were looking at things like the who is information. So that way, if I needed to contact the owner of this IP address, maybe I detected malicious activity coming from it, which is very common, then I would want to go ahead and look up their registration information and find out who I need to contact. In fact, they actually give you very detailed information on how to report suspected, suspicious, malicious activity to Netflix via Amazon. Right? So you would follow those instructions there. So again, we covered a lot of that in previous sections of the course, but here we wanted to look at DNSlytics as this way to go in and find real quickly, right, where is this IP address? And that does come into play later on in the course. Like, where in the world is this? Can I map it out to a physical location? And I'm not worried about it necessarily with the Netflix data center, but what if it's maybe a system sitting in a power plant or in a train station, right? That's very different. But now we have, again, not only an idea of a domain name, but we have an IP range. We have an entire range of IP addresses that we can look for different systems, and those systems potentially could have exposures or vulnerabilities. So we're going to talk about that more as we go throughout, and by the end of the course, you'll be able to find those vulnerabilities, again, without actively scanning, ever sending a network packet towards any of these systems. So that's DNSlytics. Again, this is just going through that walkthrough of going through and using DNSlytics to find that information out about a particular host, or you could put in an IP address and have that information pulled back. Talked about the who is information. And now we have DNSdumpster, which I found years ago now, but I couldn't believe that when I first found this, I'm like, I didn't know about it because I had still been doing pen testing for quite some time. And I was like, oh, this would have made my life so much easier. And there are other tools, again, you can run, and we'll get into some of those. And you can jump into Kali Linux and run those tools and get a lot of great information back. But in this case, again, the nice thing about DNSdumpster is it's a web page I can go to, and in 2 seconds or less, I get most of what I'm looking for. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. So let's jump back over to the browser. So we're going to go ahead and go to DNSdumpster. netflix.com. And here we're going to go ahead and put in netflix.com, which is our search, same search from earlier. And you can see, again, 2 seconds or less, I get the results back. And what the results are, you can see is it shows us where these hosts that it's found looking up in DNS records. It finds where they're at kind of loosely in the world, and it shows us where they're hosted in, typically when you talk about the different clouds that are out there. So we're going to look at those real quickly. But what we're really looking for, again, is host names. And here you can see, well, here's some hosts. And these are Amazon DNS servers. And we can see they're in the Amazon cloud over here. This is where they map the autonomous system number to the kind of the conventional or easy to remember name that you assign to that number. And we see the IP addresses, and that's fine. We're not going to typically be using these in our OSINT exercises, and we're not going to use the MX records, or those are the mail servers for Netflix.com. You can see those are not hosted at Amazon. They're hosted in the Google Cloud, or they're probably using Gmail. And there's text records. Text records actually can have interesting pieces of information because they can show relationships between your organization you're researching and other entities, especially like vendors and different applications. So you can see, like in this case, oh, they have a DocuSign text record. So yeah, they probably use DocuSign somewhere within the organization. You can see Atlassian, right? They probably use Atlassian, right? Infoblocks and Dropbox and Docker, right? So on and so forth. So it shows that relationship, and to start, right? And that's not necessarily what we're talking about here, but it gives you a quick idea, right, of what those text records could be used for. And this is what we're really looking for in this section, though, is we're looking for those host records, or the individual records. This is what DNS stores to host fully qualified domain names and map those to IP addresses. And that's really what we're ultimately looking for. And there's some kind of ugly naming conventions going on here. And there's some kind of funny ones as well, because there's a couple things to unwrap here. One is, yeah, we know there's Netflix.com, kind of this overall idea of the domain, right? Great. And then we can see, I'm going to jump ahead just for a minute. I'm going to jump down the list. And so we can see something like, oh, there's this system at nccp-nrdp-31.us-east-1-prod.aa.netflix.com, right? That naming convention means something to Netflix. And if you can figure that out, whether as an attacker or a defender, right, can help you understand, well, what type of system is this? I see something like prod. Oh, it's in production, versus something that might show as development or QA. That's important because those dev and QA environments sometimes are not as secure as production. So it might prove to be a way to break into the organization. But we see the fully qualified domain name, and that's a long, fully qualified domain name. Right? But you can also see, oh, that's the idea of where it's located as far as US-East-1. We can see the IP address, right, that it's associated with, and we know, again, it's in the Amazon cloud. I didn't mention there's some, I guess, funny ones, because here you have Obi-Wan, and you actually see there's a bunch of Star Wars names for servers and hosts, which I thought was really cool that they put in there. A couple things that shouldn't be here, though, which were interesting, is when you look at these records and you see an address of 10.46.128.25, anytime you see an IP address that starts with 10.anything, 10.anything is not a routable or legitimate IP address on the internet. So this is only for internal use only. So what we're actually seeing is that Netflix, they made a mistake, and they published internal records into DNS, but published them in their public DNS servers, which the whole world can see. Because we can see, oh, here's an IP address of 10.46.128.25, again, which doesn't work on the internet. and that it has a name of iad1-ddi01.netflix.com. So inside of Netflix, they have an IP address at this .25 address with this host. And again, that naming convention means something to it. And you can see there's a couple of other IP ranges as well, or IP addresses, right, that they're using with a similar naming convention. And you can see DDI01, DDI02, SV1, SV5. Right? Again, it means something to Netflix. We don't know what it means, at least not yet. Maybe we can find out what it means through other OSINT means. But the beauty here is that DNSdumpster takes 2 seconds if I put in a domain name, and it gets me all of these results. And you can go through, and again, there's some really interesting, if you want, targets or hosts of interest, right? moviecontrol.us-east-1, api.global, right? OCA-API, catalog dot, right? Just all these interesting what would be targets, right, for an attacker. And all of these systems can have their own vulnerabilities or exposures. We see another OB1. So we can scroll through the list. Now, when you get further down, what you'll see is at the bottom, the DNSdumpster comes back and says, oh, you hit a maximum of 100 records. You can see that they have 170 or 197 records total for Netflix.com. We're seeing 100 with the quote unquote free page. You can sign up for their paid service. The interesting thing also is if you use ReconNG, I found this out one day. If you're using ReconNG, which I think we talked about previously at the beginning of the section, which we don't cover necessarily in this course because it's lost a lot of its effectiveness. But if you do use ReconNG, which is free, and you use the Hacker Target plugin, which is the group that created DNSdumpster, they actually let you pull down 500 records for free. So if you really need more than 100 records and you don't want to pay for the records at all, you can use ReconNG to pull those down at least up to 500. So, and which would definitely cover Netflix in this case. But again, DNSdumpster is a really cool tool. Again, I didn't have to spend time even spinning up or thinking about spinning up Kali Linux and pulling up a tool and having to remember what command syntax to run, because I just go to DNSdumpster.com and put in a domain name and it's done. At least again, we get 100 records, which again is awesome, right? So that's DNSdumpster. I'm a big fan. So jumping back to the slides. So we talked about DNSlytics and DNSdumpsters, which are great web pages that you can go run a quick search and get some great information that you're looking for. The rest of the tools that we're going to talk about, these are typically going to run on Linux, right? And so, of course, anything in the cybersecurity world, we typically revolve around Kali Linux. So we're going to look at Kali Linux to run tools like subfinder here, which is it's a common tool that has now become part of the project discovery, if you want, security researcher collective. And we're going to talk about quite a few of their tools in this section. So definitely check out the tools if you're interested in more of what they do. One thing to think about, though, is we're focused on, again, the passive discovery tools in this course. Again, I never want to send a packet to a target destination without authorization, because there's the ethical considerations. Again, if I'm sending packets to a target without authorization, technically I still think I'm breaking the law. If anything, right, there's that ethical consideration. If I don't have permission to really target that environment, I shouldn't be sending packets to it. So with subfinder, it is a passive discovery tool. And the rest of these tools we're going to look at, Some of them have options to also do active discovery where they are sending packets towards the target environment. Again, that's not what we're doing in this course. We're doing completely passive discovery. And that's where I always think of OSINT. It's completely passive. I'm not sending any packets to that target environment, especially even just thinking, well, what if the environment could detect that activity? Did we want to tip them off, right? That's always a question that comes up. Usually if we're doing an OSINT engagement though, it doesn't matter. We're not trying to be sneaky, we're not trying to be covert, but we're also not attempting to send packets to the target environment. We're not doing a penetration test here. We're just doing OSINT and in part reconnaissance. So let's open up Kali Linux. So now we're in Kali Linux. So we're going to go ahead and run subfinder. And remember, subfinder is using DNS records. And we'll go ahead and you can see here, I'm just going to go ahead and use my domain like we show in the slides to start. Oops. To get an idea, right? So I'm going to do subfinder-d for domain and do myholcomb.com. And so it's going to run a search through DNS records like DNSdumpster in a way. There's some similarities and there's some different things that it does as well. But you see it comes back and says, oh yeah, in myholcomb.com, we found either one subdomain or one system, right? One fully qualified domain name, and that is, you can see, www.myholcomb.com. Great. So not really a lot of interesting things though, right? We could do it with Netflix. So if I just up arrow and go back, let's go ahead and put in Netflix.com. So remember, we were looking at Netflix using DNSdumpster. So in this case, we can get results back. We might actually see some things that we didn't see in DNSdumpster, especially with their limit of 100. And so this is also really interesting when you see that subfinder comes back and says, hey, we found 1,619 subdomains. Well, that's a lot more. That's basically 10 times what DNSdumpster said it was finding. So there was a ton of either, again, subdomains or systems, fully qualified domain names, out there for Netflix.com. Now, many of these, they might not even be active any longer, but those DNS records exist out there somewhere in the world for subfinder to look for. But now we went from having a handful of target subdomains and systems to 1,619. So I think we have more than a few to work with. Obviously, Netflix is a very, very large organization. Right? If we look at any domain, though, using subfinder, again, the whole point is we want to find the other domains or subdomains that are out there and the systems within those subdomains, because those are going to be our targets. Because remember, those systems are what have the vulnerabilities. They have those exposures that attackers would use to break into the environment. So subfinder is a really cool tool, and that's all passive discovery. And there's a couple other tools as well. So let's jump back to the slides. So remember, we had just looked at using subfinder, right? Which not only is maybe not as quick as easy as using DNSdumpster, but can give us a lot more results. Now, another tool out there is amass. I did want to mention it because it is a very popular tool for doing things like subdomain and system discovery. It is not a passive enumeration tool though. So I did want to cover it and I do use it in pen test all the time. But if we're talking about true passive discovery in OSINT, we're not going to use amass. But you can see it goes through and it looks for subdomains, systems, fully qualified domain names, right? IPs, DNS, records, net blocks, getting I don't know why I put net blocks, but subnets, right? I want to know, oh, if that /24, is it /17, like that range that we were looking at earlier. And that you can go through and you can actually see all of the different types of really items or objects that amass can actually find. Here's a screenshot. And we're not going to get into it and we don't want to cover active tools, right, in this course. But again, this one was worth mentioning. And if you are doing something like a penetration test where you have authorization to send packets, right, to a target environment, or you're doing this against your own environment, you can see that it goes through and finds things like, oh, here's these net blocks. Those are IP version 6 net blocks, so they might look really funny to you if you've never seen those before, especially this /44, like /44. How's that happen? Right? That's IP version 6. But you can see it takes net blocks and maps them to the IP addresses that are in those. Or in this case, that third line, you can see, oh, we have an IP address of 54.82.122.65, and it maps to, oh, here's that /14 range associated with that IP address. So remember, now we can go back and we can look at that entire range as a whole. We're going to do that later on using tools like Showdown. Here you can see it finds the autonomous system name, the ASN associated with that IP address, and it gives us that number of 14618. So again, we can go back and we can do a search for, hey, just show me all the subnets associated with ASN 14618. We have that option or that ability. And then you can see it finds some system names, right? So there's some fully qualified domain names like contactus.us-east-2, blah, 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 blah. And then pip proxy or pi proxy -help center blah, 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 blah. Again, all of these are different systems that could have potential vulnerabilities and exposures. So amass is a really interesting tool. It's definitely heavily leveraged in bug bounties and in penetration testing. Again, I just keep OSINT to passive tools. And you can see, and this is just an example I put in there, was if you really want to see what your tools are doing, right, you can run Wireshark behind the scenes to see, right? Is it going to send information to a target environment? Now, in this case, it looks like it's just going to Google and doing DNS lookups using Google's DNS servers. Great, right? I'm not actively sending packets to the target organization, in this case, which is Netflix. But as soon as you start seeing packets go towards the Netflix environment, that's a whole other story. All right, so I'll get off on that. Get off that soapbox. It does show you, though, that amass also has a large number of sources that it can pull from. And this is where it's not doing active scanning, where it's doing passive, which is great because it can go to all of these different online tools, most of them using an API, and pull data. Now you can see some say scrape, so it's literally just going to that page and then trying to pull information off the website, kind of like we did with the email address scraper at the beginning of the course. All right, so scraping, if you don't have authorization, is not considered ethical in most circles. So it's not something that we want to look at doing. Okay, we want to make sure we do everything with authorization. Now, SpiderFoot is a really interesting tool. I talk about it as really the shotgun approach to OSINT. And you can see it. So it was created by Steve McAuliffe, and it's been around for like a dozen years. And I found out about it, definitely pre-COVID. So it's been 5, 6, maybe 7 years. And I always say it really tries to go out and like a lot of those sources that we were just looking at that amass pulls from, SpiderFoot pretty much does the same thing, where it goes out and pulls from all these sources and it just tries to find every piece of information associated with your target. What you'll see, though, is you get just a ton of information back. And this goes back to, well, we have all this OSINT, right? We have this data that we've collected from the internet, but we really have to make it meaningful by giving it, context, putting context around it to understand what means something to us, right? What's important for us to know about. So a lot of the information, most of the information you get through SpiderFoot is going to be garbage, realistically to you. But if you can mine it for what means something, right? What's important to your organization, then it can actually find lots of, I don't know, gold nuggets if you want. I found a lot of really interesting finds using SpiderFoot that I never would have using any other tool. Like I had a client one time that they had sensitive information exposed on the darknet. SpiderFoot actually found it. I was like, oh my gosh, how did it find this? So I was really impressed with that. So you get a ton of data back and you have to sort through it. And it's a lot, usually, especially for medium, large, right? The larger the environment, the more data you get back. And the vast majority of it you're not going to use. So you have to be a little patient to dig through the data. And you'll get an idea of what I mean when we look at it here in a second. Because SpiderFoot actually now comes built into Kali Linux. So we can run it in Kali and you'll see, you get an idea of what's there. I'm not going to let the scan run for days and days, which can happen in large environments. When I run this for my day job, I think it takes about 5 days to finish up. But you'll get an idea of the type of information that we can see and kind of get an idea of the look and feel of the tool. So now that we're back into Kali Linux, when we want to start SpiderFoot, so you do SpiderFoot -L for listening port, and then we're going to give it a local IP address of 127.0.0.1, colon, and then the port we're going to have it listen on because it's going to spin up a web page or web interface that we're going to interact with. So we're going to spin this up, you can see on port 55555. It just takes a second to start. And you can see it says, hey, your web page is up and running. You don't have a password assigned. You might want to change that. So if you want to add authentication, if you're going to leave this in the course, in this case, we're not necessarily worried about it since it's just running on my local Kali instance. So let's open up our browser on the Kali Linux box. So we're going to go ahead and take that to 127.0.0.1 port 55555. And then once it loads, shouldn't be too slow. So here we're logged into the main page. And you see we don't have any scans yet, so we're going to click on New Scan. On the New Scan page, you can see there's a lot of options that we have. Now we're going to give it a name. So let's say, okay, we're going to go ahead and we're going to scan. Netflix is going to be our target environment. And we're going to give it an initial seed or a starting point of, we're just going to say netflix.com. Right? Just like we've been walking through during class. So you can see here they give you examples of not only domain names, but you can put in IP addresses, whether version 4, version 6, host names, right? The fully qualified domain names or subdomains, right? Subnets, et cetera, et cetera. So there's plenty it can go off of. Now, if we look down, there's a lot of options. We're going to look at the main page here when it talks about by use case, because this is where it gets into that last option where there's passive. We don't want the target to even suspect they're being investigated, which means, remember, we're not sending any network packets to the target environment. Now, the other options, right, have active techniques that are going to be there. And we're not going there. Again, that's for penetration testing, right? If you're doing like penetration testing, reconnaissance, great. You have the authorization to do that, or you're doing this for your own organization, great. I wish I could show you this for my day job. But for now, we're just going to do passive. Again, we're just gathering information passively, again, which is for me really kind of the thought process behind OSINT. Now, you can go in and you can say, well, what are we looking for? And you can see there's a ton of options. So we'll see some items that pop up in the Netflix search. And then you can see by module. So all these modules that you can configure that SpiderFoot searches for. Some of these they don't need an account and they'll just run the search. Some of these also you can search by API. A lot of these also are free API. So you just have to take the time to sign up for an account and plug in that username and password or the API key, and then you're good to go. So it's really cool, but it searches a lot, even just by default, without you having to do any work. And you can see, I mean, there's a ton of resources out there, which is crazy. So we're going to go back though. We're just going to say run a default passive scan. We're not adding any API keys. We're just taking the default, and we're going to click on run scan now. And we'll let it go to town. And then we'll let it run for a little bit. And so that way then we can come back and see what a SpiderFoot scan actually looks like. So when we start to get those results. So again, it's just starting, and then we'll let it run for a little bit. We'll come back and see some results. So we're back in SpiderFoot, and I went ahead and stopped the Netflix scan. Let it run for about probably an hour. And you can see it came up with a good dozen or so examples of pieces of information it found. Like you can see things we've already talked about in class, like email address or even LinkedIn URLs. So it does start to piece together a lot of what we've already been talking about from an OSINT gathering perspective, which is really cool. We can go in and look at the individual findings if we want. So we can go into the browse section. If I can click apparently. And then you can see here's all the different pieces of information that it found. So if I want, I can click on, oh, well, how about email addresses? In fact, let's see if it'll let us open it up in another tab. Nope, it won't. So if we go into that page to see the additional details, you can see each of the different types of pieces of information it found. So you can see things like, oh, it found here's some email addresses. So you can click on there and go in and see here's all of the different email addresses that it found. And you can see it found quite a few in just an hour that it was actually searching. Now, I don't know where awesome_group_1 and 2 at netflix.com into play, but they found those email addresses somewhere out on the internet, and there was B at netflix.com. But most of these are probably very legitimate, and some of those others, even if just B.net or at netflix.com, could be legitimate as well. But it gives us more information. Again, what I mentioned with SpiderFoot is it finds a ton of information. It finds often too much information. So a lot of times what you end up doing is you can export it and then go through it to find out, again, what information really is important to you and your organization or the organization that you're working on behalf of. And so we can go back and we can look at those individual findings, or you can see the different data elements. So where we found, right, 97 different email addresses, or then it's interesting because, oh, it even starts to think, oh, it found a username for a system, which is interesting, right? That would be, something worth looking into. Right? How many different domains did we find associated with Netflix.com? In this case, it doesn't look like it really got to the point where it was truly looking for things like subdomains or systems. Again, it's just a start. In a large environment, you would let it run 3, 4, 5 days and get a ton of information back. But again, you have to basically carve out what information is relevant to your organization, just like we just do in general OSINT. We gather information, it's just intelligence. We have to put additional context to give it meaning and understand what's important to us. And then ultimately, right, what we can actually do something about. So that's SpiderFoot. Now, SpiderFoot, again, pulls a lot of information. There is a newer tool called bbot. This is actually a tool that I heard Jason Haddix speaking about not long ago. I would say within the last couple months, where bbot is designed to be a more focused version of SpiderFoot, meaning instead of gathering all of this information that at the end of the day, when we go to look at the report, most of it's meaningless, that it tries to cut out all the fluff, try to cut out all the meaningless information, and just focus on what we would need from an OSINT or a penetration testing perspective. So I thought that was really interesting. I've played around with it a little bit. It's not something I have a lot of time, unfortunately, to do. But if you want to get further into doing OSINT and you get excited at the thought of using a tool like SpiderFoot, but then also come back and think, ooh, doesn't sound great if I'm getting all this extra information I have to sort through and weed out, then bbot could definitely be a alternative for you. Lastly, I did want to mention asnmap, which isn't necessarily a super exciting tool, and for most small, medium-sized environments, it doesn't even really do anything for you because most of those types of organizations don't have an autonomous system name. Remember, ASNs usually are used in medium to large size environments where they have multiple IP ranges, and they want to be able to collect those or organize them for different purposes. Like if I have multiple IP addresses and ranges that I was using for BGP, right? So I'm using it I have 2 internet connections coming into my, let's say, data center. So that way, if one of those internet connections comes down from one provider like AT&T, then all of my connectivity can go through that second connection uninterrupted. We would have to have an ASN to be able to do that. So that would be an example of why companies would use ASNs. And just very large companies like my day job, we have subnets and IP address ranges spread out all over the world. Just from an organizational perspective, it's just nice to have them all associated with one grouping. And that's what the ASN is. For our purposes, or if you have the ASN, the autonomous system number, for an organization, you can use a tool like ASNmap here to say, hey, just give me all the IP ranges that you know about that are associated with this ASN. In this case, you see autonomous system number 40360, and then it's associated with this one IP range. Right? Again, smaller, medium-sized organization, not a lot of information there. But if you went to a larger organization that had multiple IP addresses or ranges, you would see those listed. So it can help, especially in those larger environments. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. When we get later into the course, especially when we're using Shodan, these subnets are going to become extremely important because we're going to go back and look for all the assets that are exposed within a range, not just individual IP addresses. So again, just something to keep in mind for later down in the course. So with that, that's the end of this section. It's probably the shortest section that we have in the course. So I appreciate everybody for watching if you made it this far. So I appreciate you taking the time. Again, here's all the contact information. But if you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, I will see you in part 6.